In the 1969 edition of Rampart magazine, there's a print ad for an Aquarian art exposition headlined by Joan Baez, Keith Hartley, and the band. It advertised a crafts bazaar, workshops for aspiring creatives, and a massive showcase for local artists. Tickets were listed as $18 for the full 3 days, and readers were encouraged to send the advertisement back in a self-addressed stamped envelope, check, or money order with the box ticked to send me information on the Woodstock Music and Art Fair. Later that month, following a hasty venue change, nearly 500,000 people converged on Bethel, New York for a first-of-its-kind music festival experience. 3 days of peace and music presented by Woodstock Music and Art Fair, or just Woodstock for short, would go on to redefine counterculture through its careful blend of civil rights initiative, hippie community ethics, a very, 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 very large amount of psychedelics, and some of the most brilliant musicians to ever walk the face of the earth. It is undeniably the cloth from which every modern music festival is cut, from your Warped Tours to your South by Southwest to your European EDM Festival number 105. It ranks in the top half of Rolling Stone's 50 moments that changed rock and roll history. It's been considered the apex of the 60s peace and love explosion, and its legacy remains a fixture in pop culture to this day. Now fast forward a bit. In a July 2019 press release from Woodstock 50 LLC, representatives announced that the show's 50th anniversary, to be headlined by The Killers, Dead & Company, and Jay-Z, would be cancelled following a venue downgrade, failure to secure funding, fan backlash, and endless additional controversy. You'd think, considering the cultural significance of the Woodstock name, promoters would take special care to make sure that PR nightmares like this don't happen, but in fact, this much disaster is more in line with the Woodstock brand than you might realize. That's right, here's a bit of fun trivia for your next party. Did you know the best and worst music festivals of all time were both called Woodstock? And I don't even just mean Woodstock 50. Every decade or so, concert promoters have stepped up to cash in on the anniversary of the festival, and they're a mixed bag at best. But why is that? Is the blame entirely on mismanagement? Or are my parents right and us stupid kids just don't know how to do a Woodstock? Let's take a closer look at each iteration of the show and see what lies beneath the... my script just says drug reference. The original Woodstock was masterminded by promoter Michael Lang, producer Artie Kornfeld, and entrepreneurs John P. Roberts and Joel Rossaman. Those last two had already established some success building recording studios out of Manhattan, and they were approached by Lang and Kornfeld in January of that year with a pitch to build a smaller, secluded studio in the neighboring town of Woodstock, New York. This pitch was initially rejected by Roberts and Rossaman, but they liked the idea enough to repurpose it into bringing an outdoor concert to the area instead. I know, right? Don't you hate when you try to get financial backing for your new studio and you accidentally revolutionize the entire live music industry instead? Before long, the team, now dubbed Woodstock Ventures, would set out to build a lineup, secure a location, and sit back as the money rolls in. But already the team was facing an uphill battle with the venue. The original location was advertised as Mills Industrial Park in Wallkill, but by the time these print ads reached readers' hands, the information would already be out of date. Nobody in Wallkill was down with the festival taking place, so much so they bullied the city council into essentially banning live gatherings altogether just to keep it from happening. All because they were told to expect a whopping 50,000 people. For comparison, here's how many people were at Coachella the year of the housing crisis. With less than a month before the event and bands continuing to be booked, Woodstock Ventures scrambled to find a large enough open area that wasn't controlled by total squares. Help would come in the form of an unlikely dairy farmer named Max Yasgur, who offered his land in Bethel, New York to the team. Local authorities were still reluctant to grant Lang & Company the necessary permits, but did so after being assured that, again, only around 50,000 people were expected to attend. And then 500,000 people showed up. People swarmed Bethel for the show. It's hard to say exactly what about Woodstock attracted such a massive crowd because it definitely wasn't this ad. Pre-sale tickets were being sold out of record stores, and even by today's standard, this is a pretty stacked lineup. But this was an unprecedented turnout, and it completely shattered expectations. So much so that the wire fencing around the festival grounds famously had to be cut down because they could no longer safely contain the crowd or manage ticket sales. That wasn't the only bit of chaos, though. There was plenty that whole weekend. Everybody was just too busy tripping balls to Santana to really notice. Rainy New York skies made for unsanitary conditions and multiple delays. Melanie Sapka and the Loving Spoonfuls as John Sebastian were recruited to perform the day of after bands started no-showing. Traffic jams plagued the town to the point where performers needed to be airlifted into the festival to make their sets on time. Things were so behind schedule, headlining acts like Jimi Hendrix and Jefferson Airplane didn't take the stage until early that next morning. And yet, it was perfect. It wasn't all sunshine and roses, obviously, but in the face of all those obstacles, a sense of camaraderie would wash over the festival grounds, though come to think of it, that might have just been more rain. And that galvanization would define much of the counterculture movement going forward. Max Yasgur specifically offered up his land for the festival because he believed in the show's message of peace, and he said in interviews after the fact that the unity shown in Woodstock was the answer to a lot of the country's problems. Now, to be fair, the copious amounts of acid probably had something to do with that. I'm actually going to do that line again. The copious amounts of acid definitely had something to do with that. But you can see exactly where he's coming from. Following a decade of non-stop political unrest, to have so many people converging on one location for something besides an ugly protest was probably the most refreshing sight for sore eyes. What's that? You're not here to break our windows? You just want to lay naked in our fields? Come on in then! Despite the unbelievable turnout, it was impossible for Woodstock Ventures to come out with a profit due to the, everything about the show. But thanks to some well-reserved media rights, they'd find their fortune in Woodstock the movie, Woodstock the album, and Woodstock the breakfast cereal. I made up that last one, but no joke, pretty much all media coverage at the time tore into the festival for all the safety hazards and code violations. It wasn't until the movie dropped, and the soundtrack along with it, that mainstream audiences really got Woodstock. Roger Ebert famously rated it 4 out of 4, and to this day it's 100% fresh on Rotten Tomatoes. The soundtrack went gold in its original run on vinyl and a ridiculous 2 times platinum when it was later brought to CD. The audio and film crew deserve absolutely all the credit, because without them, Woodstock would have basically gone down in history as that time 400,000 hippies pissed off some farmers, instead of the cultural watershed moment we do remember it as. Okay, cool, but what happened after that? The success of the film made Woodstock a household name, but considering how much of a logistical nightmare it was for everyone involved, no one was really itching to set up a sequel. Lang and Kornfeld bowed out of the promoting game for a while, and I'm sure Roberts and Sorensen were more than happy sitting home collecting royalties from the movie. And while the Woodstock area is now quite boastful of its place in rock and roll history, residents at the time wanted to wash their hands entirely of Weekend at Bethel's. In following years, neighboring festivals would be massively scaled back and given strict caps on attendance. How strict were these caps? So strict that when Socrates officials found out their local sound out exceeded them by a whole 10 people, they had the festival president arrested. And that was it for the time being. Woodstock wouldn't be properly revisited until the event's 10-year anniversary in 1979. It started with Woodstock manager John Morris, who, alongside promoter Richard Nadler, began pitching ideas for an official Woodstock 2 to various New York counties. He was selling it as the perfect opportunity to boost a local economy, estimating a 300,000 person draw and offering up major tax breaks to whichever city agreed to host. But even a decade later, nobody wanted to touch it. They made a multi-million-dollar offer to hold the event in Woodstock itself and were flat out rejected. Morris's grand vision for a proper Woodstock 2 Electric Boogaloo would ultimately be compromised down into 2 smaller shows, August 24th and 25th at Madison Square Garden, and September 8th in Palm Meadows. And that 300,000 estimated attendance figure ended up looking a lot more like a generous 40,000. The MSG show was held in the Felt Forum and didn't include any Woodstock branding, being billed as simply a 10-year celebration. On top of a very limited number of seats available, part of their agreement with the city meant no walk-up tickets and no alcohol sales, which all but guaranteed a lackluster turnout. Palm Meadows Racetrack in Long Island hosted the other anniversary gig titled Woodstock Reunion, featuring a similar lineup and also drawing about 40,000 people, some of which camped out the night before to the complaint of neighboring businesses, nearly canceling the show altogether. I mean, is it really Woodstock if you're not pissing off the neighbors somehow? Returning acts included Country Joe and the Fish, Johnny Winter, and Richie Havens, along with solo acts from members of Woodstock bands that have since disbanded. Still a lot of great artists, but it was definitely a weaker lineup compared to the original. No offense to the artists involved, obviously. The problem isn't as much of them as it is the fact that only Woodstock alumni were booked for the event, and a lot of them didn't have the drawing power they had 10 years ago. Getting a few contemporary artists on the bill would have brought new eyes to the product. Yes, the glitz and glamour of 70s disco pushed rock and roll a bit out of the mainstream, but the hippies didn't go anywhere. Rock and folk artists were still around releasing music at the time, and Woodstock would have been a great way to showcase those performers. But considering how many hoops the promoters had to jump through just to have the show at all, I suppose I can't really blame them for keeping the bill simple. Still, it's a shame that very few recordings of the show have ever been made available outside of the rare bootleg. 1989 would mark the year's 20-year anniversary and the only time the show would ever return to Bethel. It's often referred to as the Forgotten Woodstock because it was put together on very short notice and on essentially no budget. It all started with kindergarten teacher Rich Pell, who who visited the Woodstock grounds on a whim one day and started playing guitar with some of the tourists camped out there. The jam session started attracting a crowd, and before long people were contributing instruments, power, and things only grew from there. The property owners saw this going on and gave their blessing so long as order were maintained, acknowledging Pell as a sort of de facto MC. Everything from the stage to the sound equipment was locally sourced. The lineup was entirely open mic. Pell didn't feel right turning anyone away, so they just kept signing up people and the music kept going. Performers ranged from small children to Jimi Hendrix's father. The same time this was going on, a local boxing promotion was holding their own Remember Woodstock event at the Imperial Hotel, and it was entirely eclipsed by the gathering in Bethel. So much so, Melanie Savka, hi Melanie, who was booked for Remember Woodstock, actually bailed on the show to go and join up with Rich and company. And this continued for 8 days. 8 days! What started as a teacher playing guitar with some campers snowballed into 150,000 concert goers returning to Bethel over the anniversary week for over 200 performances. Granted, it faced a lot of the hurdles you would expect from an impromptu concert, and that was on top of hotel staff flocking to the site, begging people to go to their show instead. But these obstacles were all overcome through Pell's dedication to peace, and the community rallied behind him. He sent around donation hats to cover bathrooms and water trucks. He asked people to chip in gas for the generator, and he had more tanks than he knew what to do with. Local chefs brought in food, musicians lined up to add equipment to the stage, and people even stayed after to help clean up. It is unreal just how well Rich pulled this off, and of all the Woodstock revivals over the years, it doesn't get more authentic than this. Once again, it feels very emblematic of counterculture of the time. A lot of communities were devastated after a decade of materialism and Reaganomics. Woodstock 89 outright rejected all of that in favor of the unity and camaraderie that made the original so special, and it did so masterfully. There was a legitimate anniversary show 20 minutes away with actual alumni on the bill, and this impromptu open mic night on steroids completely blew it out of the water. Pell admitted after the fact that it was a borderline miracle nothing went wrong and that everyone who showed up just happened to be cool. There was no contingency plan had things gone south, and Pell would have been on the hook for all of it. That being said, Woodstock 89, at its very worst, would have been nothing compared to what the brand would face in the 90s. 1994 marked Woodstock's 25th anniversary, and Michael Lang would reunite Woodstock Ventures to put on its biggest show yet, a proper Woodstock for the next generation. August 12, 1994, nearly another 500,000 people would converge on Socrates, New York, for what was billed as 2 more days of peace and music. This is when the show really started to resemble festivals as we know them today. Nicer end equipment, tighter security, higher price point, and a much larger variety of acts. And it's all thanks to a partnership with a little network called MTV. You know MTV, the Teen Mom channel? I can't find anywhere online to confirm this, but my dad insists that MTV used to be a music platform, so I'll have to take his word for it. But yeah, MTV was simulcasting the entire event, and through them they lined up a ton of sponsorship from beverage and snack companies. Now, depending on who you ask, the Woodstock x MTV collab is either a brilliant modernization of a counterculture staple, or a soulless bastardization that laughs in the face of the original. On the one hand, MTV, like Woodstock, revolutionized perform music as we know it, and that can't really be taken away from them. I'm sure there's some marketing tweet out there that's drooling all over the crossover potential there. But on the other hand, MTV was definitely starting to look uncool at this point. The short version goes that MTV started out cool and edgy, then everyone realized they were hella racist and stopped liking them, then they eased up on the racism, embraced hip-hop, and everyone was pretty much okay with them again. Then in the 90s, a lot of bands started calling out MTV for being part of the corporate media machine, and the network's reputation never recovered. So yeah, for a lot of people, it didn't really seem right for such a strong symbol of 60s anti-capitalism to be co-opted by the man like this. Henry Rollins told the crowd during his performance that Woodstock 94 was simply the hippies cashing in on all the money they were too high to make in the 60s, and the thing is that he's kind of right. The original Woodstock was always conceived as a money-making opportunity and was shopped around to cities as such, a way to cash in on the lucrative hippie demographic by appealing to their love of the arts. They only cut down the fences and made the event free after it was made abundantly clear that collecting tickets would have been impossible. Following 20 years off the project and some goodwill finally being established thanks to Woodstock 89, I'm sure Michael Lang and company looked at the booming 90s alternative scene and saw dollar signs. It's either that, or they saw Wayne's World 2 the year before, which also features a 90s Woodstock headlined by Aerosmith, and thought, you son of a bitch, I'm in. They did include some returning Woodstock acts like Santana and Joe Cocker, as well as artists like Bob Dylan, who famously declined to appear at the first Woodstock but would make their debut here. But besides that, the lineup resembles more of an MTV programming block than anything else. Green Day, Salt and Pepper, Aerosmith, Blind Melon, Arrested Development, and many more names were spread across the event's north and south stages. And while the modern lineup solved the problems of Woodstock 79, attracting a massive crowd, the reliance on heavier acts would raise the eyebrows of many purists. That's right, here's another fun fact for your next party. Led Zeppelin never played Woodstock. Simon and Garfunkel never played Woodstock. Metallica played Woodstock twice. It's very easy to look at all the problems with modern Woodstocks and blame it all on that pivot towards heavier content. Yes, the idea of a peace festival featuring Nine Inch Nails is objectively hilarious, but I'd argue that's not the whole story. Much like violent video games or any other media, someone liking aggressive music doesn't necessarily mean they're an aggressive person. Yes, hardcore dancing looks painful and ridiculous, but that doesn't automatically make every metal show a violent risk to the community. If that were the case, there wouldn't be multiple successful festival series dedicated to heavier genres. People drinking too much and making asses of themselves? Yeah, that happens, but even the brutalest of shows generally have positive atmospheres to them. Almost as if people don't put money down on these events just to be a mean-spirited public menace. When things do go sour, and we will see in a minute here, it's usually the result of mismanagement from those in charge. So yeah, I think a quote-unquote edgier sounding Woodstock would have been totally fine, so long as you continue to evoke the spirit that made the original so special. And by spirit, I mean rain. That's right, precipitation, the Woodstock MVP, right up there with the brown acid, back again to drown hippies and embarrass promoters. There was a lot of it that weekend, so much so the event is affectionately referred to in some circles as Mudstock. Why Mudstock? I don't know, ask Green Day. Woodstock 94 looked at the muddy conditions of the original and said, "Hold my coffee cup that's also filled with mud." Dirt was kicked up at every turn, mosh pits were turned into mud wrestling pits, and infamous performances from the likes of Primus and Jackal only encouraged things to get messier. Thankfully, like Woodstocks of the past, the vibe would remain peaceful, all things considered. Critics praised the show's variety, and Woodstock alumni were even surprised at just how warm of a reception they got alongside the more popular acts. Once again, the camaraderie of the original would come out on top, and whether or not you agree with the more commercialized event, the important thing for the promoters was that it was a success. Home media versions of the show would once again be produced thanks to Daddy MTV, and once again they were all bought up by all the kids whose parents wouldn't let them go, prompting Michael Lang to cry "what the hell" 5 years later and press their luck one more time with the show's 30th anniversary, Woodstock 1999. Galvanized by the success of Mudstock, plans were to go even bigger with Woodstock 99. Multiple stages, more MTV coverage, more vendors, overnight raves, and even a film festival. That July, some 400,000 attendees met on the recently retired Griffiths Air Force Base in Rome, New York. There were some returning faces from 94, but notably for the first time, no original Woodstock alumni on the card, save for a few guest appearances. Not to worry though, guys, my friends in Limp Bizkit, Insane Clown Posse, and Rage Against the Machine will carry that torch with pride. Well, maybe not that torch, but a torch. You'll see what I mean in a sec. Now, while MTV was out trying to see how many dads they could get to say "there goes the neighborhood" at the lineup, promoters were on a mission to finally solve one of the festival's oldest problems. How the hell do fences work? Pretty much every Woodstock up to this point has had a reoccurring problem with people sneaking into the show, often in greater numbers than the staff can keep up with. It's the reason the original show never turned a profit, and I'm sure the promoters aren't bitter about that at all. That's why they didn't resort to building a border wall around the airstrip to trap people like rats. Wait, what? This is the Peace Wall. Yes, that's what it's called, stop laughing. A 12-foot tall wooden wall spanning the festival grounds. It's probably the most iconic thing about the show not related to someone's criminal record. They at least went through the trouble of decorating it with some fun murals, but honestly it just reminds me of those non-threatening graphics companies use when they're trying to tell you it's really not a big deal, they can just open your webcam whenever. Oh yeah, don't worry about that, guys, that's just the Peace Wall. It's here to keep you safe, and definitely not to keep you bastards from hopping our fences. Now go buy a $6 water bottle and stop asking questions. Yeah, another neat side effect of the enclosed concert space meant attendees were stuck with whatever was being sold on site for food and amenities, and vendors had absolutely no problem inflating their prices to cable company levels of malicious. So if you coughed up the money for this event and want to, I don't know, not die of dehydration, your options are either A, walk a full mile to wait in line for one of like 2 free water fountains, B, leave the grounds entirely and catch a bus to take your chances at one of the corner stores in town, or C, fork over potentially all the cash on you for a measly 20 ounces of liquid. Now you could argue that this is simply the price of convenience, doing what it always does under supply and demand. And to that I say, piss off Mad Money, I'm dying of heat stroke. Because when I say no Woodstock alumni, that goes double for our MVP in the clouds. For once, no rain. Instead, sweltering 100-degree heat and very little shade was the name of the game. The tarmac of the airstrip only intensified the hot temperatures, and unlike previous years, there were no natural streams or foliage to take refuge in. Things would only worsen from there. As the wooden walls became packed with concert goers, it quickly became obvious that the promoters cut corners elsewhere in their efforts to craft a profitable Woodstock. Sure, the stages looked fine and that peace wall is something to look at, I guess, but the festival was lacking in bathrooms, free water, first aid, and a lot of basic necessities for managing a crowd this size. The enclosed concert space meant people were stuck without any alternatives once resources dried up, and while some performers tried to draw attention to the issues, the staff remained mostly apathetic about it. So, if you're looking at this wood-lined biohazardous capitalist sweatshop featuring Limp Bizkit and thinking that wasn't very peace-loving music of you, well, you'd be right, and the attendees would probably agree. They were pissed. Perhaps the promoters thought that the unifying energy of Woodstock's past would shine through and the crowd would once again remain peaceful, but in the face of heat exhaustion, laughably priced food, and overflowing toilets, people weren't feeling the peace. People felt scammed. Keep in mind what people were signing up for. This was the 30th anniversary of the original Woodstock. Already by this point, people had grown up hearing about the legend of Woodstock and how it was this once-in-a-lifetime marriage of music and community. This imagery was specifically repackaged and sold back to them for the 90s Woodstocks. Sold back to them at over $200 a ticket, might I add. This next bit is the ugliest and most people already know it, so I'll be quick. Crowds overrun and wrecked the free water fountains, leading to a lot of vendors getting looted for supplies. Much of the volunteer security abandoned their post. Over half a dozen assaults were reported, mostly during Limp Bizkit's set. People started breaking away boards of the peace wall in an attempt to break out of the festival, but the worst was saved for the very last. During the Red Hot Chili Peppers' headlining performance, candles were handed out to the audience members as part of a candlelight vigil to take place later in the set. Before long, the candles were being used to start bonfires and incite more chaos across the grounds. As the Chili Peppers wrapped their set with a thoughtful but poorly timed Jimi Hendrix tribute, the violence grew uncontrollable. Trucks and ATMs were destroyed, fire spread to one of the control towers, the rest of the peace wall came down to become kindling, and with seemingly no other option, New York State troopers were brought in to contain the crowd. Reports from the next day described black clouds and an ominous smell over the area as local fire department and law enforcement worked overnight to restore the grounds. Trucks were still smoldering well into the next morning. Promoters told the press that they were heartbroken by the events and that we may never know why these kids did this. Yeah, guy, you got no idea at all? I mean, I can think of a few reasons. I'm sure if I had to watch Alanis Morissette live while rolling around in human waste, I'd probably want to break something too. Co-founder Michael Lang said at a press conference following the close of '99 that despite everything, he remained confident that the anniversary shows would continue, and that the spirit of Woodstock remains alive and well. What even is the spirit of Woodstock at this point? Is it just the failure to make money? In the days that followed, more reports from behind the peace wall would surface, bringing to light the unsanitary festival grounds, exploitative vendors, and greed on behalf of the promoters. The San Francisco Examiner would call it the day the music died, and it called into question whether or not a large-scale Woodstock like this could ever happen again. And so far, it doesn't look like it. There was no festival for the 40th anniversary in 2009. Instead, we got Heroes of Woodstock, an independently organized tour headlined by Jefferson Starship, hosted by Country Joe McDonald, and featuring a whole slew of Woodstock alumni. Probably for the best they went that route instead of a traditional festival. The disaster of '99 was just too fresh in people's minds. But against everyone else's better judgments, Michael Lang knew he wanted to give the classic festival one more go for the 50th anniversary in 2019. And in March of that year, it was announced that Woodstock 50 would be coming to Watkins Glen that August. Once again, contemporary artists would fill out the card, including the likes of Miley Cyrus, Chance the Rapper, and Imagine Dragons. But they would be joined alongside a returning Santana, John Fogerty, David Crosby, and others. The lineup looked promising, but many people were skeptical of the rebooted festival. For many, it was the fact that the Woodstock name simply never recovered after '99. Some felt that the peace and music branding had grown disingenuous, especially in the increasingly polarized 21st century climate, and I'm sure at least one person was mad they didn't bring back ICP. Like Woodstocks of old, getting this show off the ground proved to be a struggle in pretty much every way. Tickets were to go on sale that April, but never did. Not a good start. Then the investment firm in charge of funding bailed on the project. After falling behind on payments, they lost their venue in June and relocated to the Merriweather Pavilion in Maryland, massively scaling back capacity to do so. The change in financial backing ended up voiding the majority of performer contracts, and nearly every name dropped from the show as a result. And that finally brings us back to July 2019, the final nail in the coffin, where Michael Lang announced via press release that, following unforeseen circumstances, Woodstock 50 would not be going forward. An independently organized 50th anniversary show would take place at the Bethel Center of the Arts and would feature Fogerty and Santana after dropping from Woodstock 50. But to date, those who currently own the Woodstock name and branding have no new plans to revive the festival. It likely won't be until the 60-year anniversary in 2029 that we'll see another Woodstock branded event, and even then I doubt it'll live up to the cultural relevance of the original, or even the infamy of the 90s variants. The 2020 pandemic put much of the live music industry on hold, so it honestly might be a while before you see even any events of that size in the West again. Say what you will about live stream concerts, but the chances of getting covered in someone else's waste is significantly lower. So is that it? Is today's youth just doomed to never have their own countercultural watershed moment and it's all Fred Durst's fault? Well, not exactly. What ruined Woodstock was the endless pursuit of making lightning strike not only twice, but multiple times in succession. Promoters were so determined to spin the festival into a cash cow franchise that they never stopped to notice that it was the anti-commercialism that made the original so special in the first place. Like I said, the original Woodstock was a logistical failure as far as everyone involved was concerned. To them, cutting down the fence and opening the event to the public was probably their way of saving face had things gone violent. But to the people who were there, cutting down the fence was the beauty of Woodstock. That's what turned it from just an outdoor concert to a collective of powerful young voices, inviting people from all walks of life to rise above the systems they're in, and all in the name of peace. Woodstock 94 might have been the money-making one, but I can't help but wonder at what cost. Visually, it's indistinguishable from Lollapalooza, Coachella, or even Vans Warped Tour. Had 99 not been a colossal failure, we likely would have seen even more of these MTV stocks until they'd be viewed as nothing but another cog in the festival circuit, all character wiped away from it like that one episode of SpongeBob we all hate. So maybe Woodstock won't be this generation's Woodstock, but that's fine. The important thing is something else will be. Our communal monkey brains are always looking for new and unique ways to bring us together, and the social media age has completely rewritten the book on how ideas are exchanged. Maybe your Woodstock was being in your school's musical, or playing Pokemon Go with your community, or marching with Black Lives Matter, or attending the Battle of the Joshes, I don't know. Whatever it may be, if the unity is there, that's what's important. Also, I just dug through like 50 years of musical history. I still have no idea what an Aquarian art exhibition is.